let's get to it. Let's just start with Sri Lanka. You've been doing some good work on that. I know it's a difficult topic to research, to study. There's been a lot made about it. I think the most principal argument that I've heard out of the corporate media is that the unrest there, the deposing of the government, that the roots of it are China, right? China leveled a debt trap on Sri Lanka, and we haven't heard much about the real political character of the protests. And you've been doing some research on it. So let's just spend a few minutes, if you could, just talking about what's the myths and what's the reality from what you've been able to find out thus far.
Well, I've heard the Western media cite debt trap diplomacy by China for quite a while, actually, long before the protests started in Sri Lanka. And, you know, just scratching a little bit under the surface, you will see that it's not that at all. If you, they have articles on DW, which is Western media, German state media. They've got the little graph there that shows that China debt to China is only 10%. The rest of it is to the Asian Development Bank, the World Bank, Japan, and also these bonds. And the bondholders are all Western financial institutions. So it's obviously not Chinese debt trap diplomacy. There's way more debt owed to many others, and it's mostly owed to Westerners. So this is what we see the West do all the time, this projection where they're actually the ones preying on Sri Lanka and other countries like it, and they're not giving them anything for this money. China at least is giving them physical, tangible infrastructure, and then they blame China because it's a good excuse. It helps distract people. It's also fitting in with their anti-China agenda, which I guess we'll also be talking quite a bit about later on. So that part is actually being reported by some in the Western media. DW, Nikkei, which is very pro-Western, they did an article about who these bondholders were, and then I started doing a little research into the protests themselves, and it's kind of a collection of different groups. Obviously, these are not spontaneous protests. Most protests aren't spontaneous. Even good protests that you might agree with, they're not spontaneous. There's always leadership and there's always money behind them, because people going out into the streets for long periods of time requires resources and logistics. It's just a fact. These protests, it looks like it's a combination of opposition parties opportunistically using this as an opportunity to try to get themselves into power. There's also these, like quote unquote youth groups. And if you look at the leadership of these youth groups, they're people involved in U.S. government-funded National Endowment for Democracy associated organizations. And it's the same story everywhere you look. As a matter of fact, that's how I'm able to find these groups so quickly, because I'm very familiar with them everywhere else. And they're uncreative. U.S. is very uncreative. They've got, it's like almost the same acronym, except they changed the first letter because it's a different country. It's ridiculous. You could spot it. It's so easy to spot once you know how. And that's what's going on in Sri Lanka. So it's a combination of opposition parties and these U.S.-funded opposition groups who may or may not be working together. It's hard to tell. You got to get very familiar with the political system, and like you were saying before the show, it's still kind of playing out. So there's a lot to keep track on, but people should keep their eyes open and their mind open, and not just jump to conclusions. That's for sure.
Yeah, I feel like with something like Sri Lanka, like a lot of, we could call it color revolutions, or just instances of what you could call like it's kind of like an ambiguous abstract unrest. We don't get to hear about, okay, what are the actual political demands? What is being fought for? What is being responded to? There's obviously, inflation, the economic crisis in Sri Lanka was horrific, but no coverage about the roots of that. What are the roots of this, Brian? Like, it seems pretty obvious what's going on in the world that makes inflation and economic crisis for a dependent country like Sri Lanka so problematic. But could you tell our viewers what's the roots of Sri Lanka's economic crisis?
Well, they had a very long and destructive civil war. I guess you could call it a civil war, but if you really look into it, obviously, again, rebel armies don't just pop out of nowhere. They don't just, make their own guns. So it was, if you dig into it, you'll see the U.S. was heavily involved in arming these militants. It was highly destructive. It set a lot back for Sri Lanka. And then once it was over, they were kind of on their way to recovery. But they're doing all of this business with the West, with these so-called development organizations, and what that really is, it's predatory lending. And so they were digging a hole in debt, and then COVID hit, and the travel restrictions really hurt the economy. There's a big component is tourism. And if nobody's traveling at all, there goes your tourist industry, and everyone linked to it are going to suffer. And the government doesn't have, any savings or any way to compensate these people until things get back to normal, which was actually quite a while before that happened. So it's just one thing after the other after the other. And that's why you look at a lot of other nations, they invest so much on being self-sufficient to try to avoid this, or they diversify their economy so that if one market gets hit, is not the end of their whole economy. Sri Lanka is suffering because multiple disadvantages. Plus, they're a former British colony, and most former British colonies are very divided societies, and they've got a lot of issues that persist even to this day. So it's a combination of factors, I think. And then, as you alluded to, the sanctions, the Western sanctions against Russia, a growing list of sanctions against China, all of this hits smaller countries like Sri Lanka pretty hard.
Yeah, it definitely has an isolating effect, and I'm sure you're familiar with. You mentioned diversifying the economy. Well, there's an example that the U.S. media harpoons on the port of Hambantota, this port that was built. Sri Lanka couldn't finance it on its own. The West wanted nothing to do with it. Canadian companies, all they looked at this situation. They're like, no, we're not going to invest. Typical story of Western countries looking at poorer countries that are dependent on them and saying, no, we're not going to actually build anything for you. So China decided to engage in the project. And then Sri Lanka couldn't finance it. Sri Lanka was their debt. They had political. You mentioned the political crisis that happened there even before this past one. So Sri Lanka had to lease it to China. And what did China do? Did China say, "Oh, you have to pay us"? No, everything that Sri Lanka was paying on that lease was going to foreign creditors, not Chinese creditors. It was going to Western financial institutions. So in effect, this whole idea of China debt trap diplomacy is so ridiculous. But you'll even hear it now when you have these intense sanctions on Russia that are creating just shockwaves, especially in Europe and the United States, which then creates shockwaves in those countries that are dependent on them, financially,
Yeah.
at least.
Yeah. I mean, the whole idea of China debt trap diplomacy, it's just another one of these things that they make up, and they keep pushing it so often that people just take it for fact, and it's ridiculous. There's a high-speed rail network being built across Southeast Asia. The section through Thailand is already under construction, and we'll hear stories about that trap diplomacy here when Thailand is actually financing it themselves. It's not being financed by China, not to my knowledge. And so it just goes to show you they're just going to throw that in no matter what, because it's just about smearing. They know most people aren't going to look into it. And when it comes to China, people have a lot of prejudices to begin with that make them want to believe that. It's not hard to get them to go along with negative news about China. And so they do. It's very unfortunate.